Good evening. Welcome to This Week in Turkey. Europe is on the spotlight once again, following a recent decision by the Council of Europe to restart a political monitoring process on Turkey. Our first video tonight is an overview of Turkey's political involvement with Europe in the past decades.
Que nous avons, à notre congrès de la Haye, demandé la création d'une assemblée européenne.
The Council of Europe was founded in 1949 to uphold human rights, democracy and rule of law in Europe. Turkey was invited to the organization as a founding member alongside Greece and Iceland in August 1949, constituting the country's first institutional tie with Europe after World War II. Turkey also is a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights, the backbone agreement of the Council signed in 1950. Turkey's involvement with Europe continued with its application to join the European Economic Community in 1958. The result of this application was the Ankara Agreement, signed in 1963, suggesting the establishment of an association between European Economic Community and Turkey until the latter fulfilled the adequate standards to join the community. After a long period of negotiations between two bodies, Turkey joined the Customs Union in January 1996, which was considered as the final phase that initiated the way to accession of Turkey to EU. A new chapter began in Turkey-EU relations with Turkey's assumption of candidate status in 1999 at the Helsinki Summit. 5 years later, at the Brussels Summit held in December 2004, the European Council declared that Turkey had sufficiently fulfilled the political criteria and decided to open accession negotiations in 2005. Turkey's progress in integration with the European Union has significantly enhanced its relations with the Council of Europe, a separate body from the EU but still closely watched in Brussels. Turkey achieved substantial progress in cooperation with the Council in issues such as abolition of death penalty, fight against torture, civil-military relations, and minority rights. As a result of the reforms realized in the previous era and the opening of accession negotiations, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe decided to close the monitoring procedure on Turkey in 2004. In 2010, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu was elected as the President of the Parliamentary Assembly for 2 years. This Tuesday, on May 25th, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe voted to restart monitoring Turkey. Monitoring is a procedure involving regular visits by a pair of rapporteurs and occasional debates to ensure that a state's progress and problems are being assessed in line with Council of Europe standards. This decision, which indicates severe doubts about Turkey's progress, is seen as a significant step backwards in Turkey's relations with the European Union.
Europe's top human rights body, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, has voted to reopen the monitoring procedures in Turkey on Tuesday. The decision reflects a strong concern over the functioning of democratic institutions in the country.
One of Europe's leading human rights bodies, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, has decided to reopen a political monitoring process against Turkey following the April 16th referendum on constitutional reform, putting pressure on the EU to reassess relations with Ankara. After having discussed a report titled The Functioning of Democratic Institutions in Turkey, the resolution was passed with 113 votes, with 45 against and 12 abstaining. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe voted to restart monitoring Turkey, a process quitted in 2004 when intended to begin accession talks with the European Union. Being monitored by the Council of Europe means Turkey will be subject to frequent visits by human rights officials and debated more often in the Strasbourg chamber. 9 other Council of Europe countries who are subject to this kind of monitoring are Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Moldova, Russia, Serbia and Ukraine. The Council of Europe, co-founded by Winston Churchill in 1949, is a separate body from the EU, but its decisions are closely watched in Brussels. EU foreign affairs ministers are due to discuss EU-Turkey relations on Friday for the first time since Erdogan's narrow victory, which gave him unprecedented new powers. Ankara, one of the Council's oldest members, said it was now reconsidering its relations with the body. Deciding to reopen the monitoring procedure on Turkey under the guidance of malicious circles at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe is a disgrace to this organ, which claims to be the cradle of democracy, a Turkish government statement said. Moreover, EU Affairs Minister and Chief Negotiator Ömer Çelik also criticized the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe decision, saying that the Council and the Assembly made a historical mistake. Europe has adopted an exclusionist attitude instead of fulfilling its responsibilities towards Turkey, Çelik added. On the other hand, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Tuesday also criticized the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe decision. Ankara does not recognize the entirely political decision, Erdogan told Reuters news agency. Furthermore, if they are not acting sincerely, we have to find a way out. Why should we wait any longer? We are talking about 54 years, he said.
Our guest in the studio tonight is Senem Aydın Düzgit. Welcome.
Thank you.
She's an associate professor of international relations at Sabancı University and also an academic affairs coordinator at the Istanbul Policy Center. Her academic focus is on Turkey-EU relations, Turkish foreign policy, as well as EU foreign policy. So, Ms. Düzgit, let's start talking about the recent decision that came from the Council of Europe. As we've watched in the previous news video, this is seen as a significant step backwards in Turkey-EU relations. So my first question to you is on the details of this decision. Could you elaborate on the contents and the details of this decision? And perhaps if I was to paraphrase the question, what does this mean really for Turkey-EU relations, and how serious do you think this decision is?
Well, this is a serious decision and a very unfortunate decision indeed, considering the fact that Turkey was being monitored by the Council of Europe between 1996 and 2004, and in fact this monitoring was lifted back in 2004, so that's roughly about 13 years ago, and now 13 years later we're back to square one. In terms of the democratic progress that this country has achieved. This monitoring procedure is something which the Council of Europe initiated in early 1990s with respect to the transitioning to democracy by Central and Eastern European countries after the end of the Cold War. So this was in fact designed for them. But Turkey, because of its democratic deficiencies at the time, but also as a Council of Europe member, was being subject to this monitoring procedure, as I said, between 1996 and 2004. Because of the democratic reform process, which was initiated in Turkey in late 1990s, and particularly in the first half of 2000s, this monitoring process was lifted in 2004. And at the time, it was lifted on the grounds that Turkey had made substantial progress with its democratic track record, so that the monitoring was no longer needed. And in fact, this was a fundamental decision. It was a fundamental decision which led and contributed to the European Union's decision to open accession negotiations with Turkey in 2005. Because it was seen as an important indicator that Turkey was now sufficiently fulfilling the Copenhagen political criteria, which was, of course, a fundamental criteria for any candidate country to start accession negotiations with the EU. So in that sense, it's very unfortunate that we had to go back for more than a decade ago to where we actually started the whole process. And it is serious because this is the first time, in fact, that a European country which is a member of the Council of Europe and which is not being monitored is being put back in the monitoring agenda. So this has never happened in the history of the Council of Europe before. And I think it's quite telling of the process of democracy in Turkey as well. So in that sense, it is serious because it's a formal indication of where things are going, politically speaking, in Turkey. And it is also serious because it hampers Turkey's relationship with the Council of Europe. And of course, Turkey is a founding member of the Council of Europe, but also with the European Union, since the European Union looks at the steps taken by the Council of Europe or the evaluations of the Council of Europe when it tries to make evaluations on the democratic track record of its candidate countries, which in this case, of course, is Turkey.
So let's now focus a bit on Ankara's response to this decision. They actually made very strong statements saying that they were now reconsidering their relations with the Council, and that this decision was indeed a product of, I quote, malicious circles within the Assembly. And President Erdogan expressed further discontent by stating that, again, I quote, we need to find a way out of this body if the situation continues like this. And these are very strong statements. So how do you think these will affect Turkey-EU relations? Or let me ask it like this, is Turkey's European journey over?
Well, I think it's still a little early to say that it's completely over but of course things are not looking very promising, let's put it that way, to say the least. In terms of the government's statement on this, I mean, it's very difficult to evaluate where they stand on this, because on the one hand, they make these statements, but on the other hand, I think it was today that one of the president's top advisors had mentioned how Turkey's relationship with the EU was so important. So they give these equivocal messages concerning Turkey's relationship with the EU, and it's a little bit difficult sometimes, especially as academics ourselves, to assess how serious they are in terms of severing Turkey's relations with the EU or the West, or they're just, using it as a bluff or for the purposes of domestic politics. So in that sense, it's a little bit difficult to work it out. But of course, if it's the first one, so if they really mean what they say in terms of further hampering the ties between Turkey and Europe, well, I do see it again as very unfortunate, since, I mean, I personally am of the opinion that Turkey has huge interests in having very close ties with Europe and also with the West in general. So in that sense, its membership of the Council of Europe, as well as its journey with the European Union, is very important.
It's interesting that you mentioned the intersection of domestic and foreign interests, because my next question is mostly on that. Turkey's recent disputes with Germany and the Netherlands were interpreted as domestic policy stunts, basically, artificial crises to mobilize voters prior to the referendum. Now that the referendum is over, do you think that the response of the Turkish government now represents a new low in Turkey-EU relations, one that is unprecedented, perhaps?
Well, if we have to speak about what happened before the referendum, yes. I mean, I thought that was a foreign policy stunt, which was primarily designed to satisfy or to increase certain constituencies and possibly to consolidate some more votes in the referendum. And I think it partially worked as well in some circles, because it has a resonance across the government parties' key core constituencies. So in that sense, yes, and it wasn't, of course, just a strategy on the part of the Turkish government. We know that this happened just prior to the Dutch elections, and it was largely strategized or being subject to strategizing on the part of the Dutch government at the time as well. But having said that, I think it's not just an issue of strategy. I think it was also a reflection of a larger worldview of where Turkey belongs. And I think in that mindset and worldview, Turkey does not belong to the West and Europe and should not be bound by the democratic conditionality or criteria that is imposed by the European Union. But of course, on the one hand, you might share that worldview and your constituency might largely share that worldview, but then the interests of the country lie somewhere else, meaning that 50% of your trade takes place with this institution, that is the European Union. Your main source of foreign direct investment are the European Union countries. There are about 4 to 5 million Turkish origin Turks, citizens living in the EU countries, and many other ties that bind the two together, and there doesn't seem to be any alternative locus of power for Turkey except Europe itself. So in that sense, yes, they might have that worldview, and yes, even if that worldview is being instrumentalized for domestic purposes, I'm not sure whether it is sustainable in the longer run from a strategic and interest-based perspective.
My last question is about a meeting that took place today, the meeting of EU foreign ministers who gathered today to assess the Union's relations with Turkey. And there's no official statement yet. It's not out yet, but it's expected to be published tomorrow. What's your prediction on the outcome of this meeting? What kind of a result do you think will come out?
Well, I mean, it is difficult to speculate, but I think we might be looking at two scenarios. I mean, on the one hand, you have the German elections coming up in September, and the Germans might not risk their relations with Turkey, particularly the migration deal, before the elections. So they might be pushing for the continuation of this formal accession negotiations, at least until the end of the summer. That is, until the German elections. But then, of course, afterwards, we might be looking at a different scenario when the election process is over. So that's one scenario we're looking at. But on the other hand, we know that there is also immense pressure on the EU member states that relations with Turkey have completely stagnated, as the Enlargement Commissioner has also recently indicated, and that there should be a new path or there should be a new vision to Turkey's relationship with the EU. And part of that vision could be a temporary suspension of the accession negotiations. So an alternative or second scenario could be the mandate given to the Commission by the EU member states to come up with a proposal to put Turkey-EU relationship on a different track and thus to temporarily suspend accession negotiations with Turkey on the grounds of its recently deteriorated track record in democracy, human rights and the rule of law.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Professor Düzgit, for your comments.
Thank you very much for having me
tonight.
Thank you.
We'll continue with our next news video. The official results of the April 16th constitutional referendum were announced on Thursday, despite ongoing criticisms and objections by the opposition.
Despite the ongoing criticism from the opposition parties, the official results of the April 16 constitutional referendum was released on Thursday, announcing that the constitutional amendments had been accepted. Following the announcement, the ruling Justice and Development Party is expected to have its convention to elect President Erdogan as its chairman. On Thursday night, the High Electoral Board released the official results of the constitutional referendum. Sadi Güven, the head of the High Electoral Board, announced that the yes side received 51.41% of the votes, while the no votes received 48.59%. The participation of the referendum was 85%. Güven noted that the board declares on behalf of the Turkish nation that the constitutional amendments had been accepted. The High Electoral Board also announced the justification of the rejection to the opposition party's appeal, stating that necessary conditions for illegality was not reached during the process. The opposition parties had previously appealed to the High Electoral Board's decision to accept unsealed ballots as valid, citing the constitutional change in 2010, which stated that unsealed ballots were to be considered invalid. The announcement was made a day after the Council of State had also rejected the appeal to repeal the Election Board's decision. In its preliminary justification, the Council of State stated that it is not possible to appeal the decisions of High Election Board regarding the elections. A detailed justification for its ruling is expected to be released shortly. Following the decisions, the main opposition, Republican People's Party, once again announced that it would appeal to European Court of Human Rights over the referendum results. Furthermore, in a broadcast on Medyascope, the Gaziantep Parliament member and former Nationalist Movement Party member Ümit Özdağ also noted that, due to the illegal acts of the High Election Board, this referendum is dirty, and raised a question on whether this would be the last fair election the country would have in the near future. Despite all, following the announcement of the official results of the referendum, the ruling Justice and Development Party is set to hold an extraordinary convention on May 21st to elect President Erdogan as its chairman. Furthermore, following his meeting with the National Movement Party leader Devlet Bahçeli, Prime Minister Yildirim stated that the two parties discussed the cooperation to harmonize the existing laws with the amended constitution.
The Turkish army carried out airstrikes on Monday against PKK targets near Iraq's Sinjar Mountains and northeastern Syria to prevent the group from sending weapons and explosives for attacks inside Turkey.
The Turkish military said on April 25th that it killed 40 militants in northern Iraq and 30 others in northeastern Syria. It has also stated that Turkish Air Force has hit a Peshmerga position by mistake, killing 6 Peshmerga troops. The Turkish army said in a statement, "To destroy terror hubs which threaten the security, unity and integrity of our country and our nation, and as a part of our rights based on international law, airstrikes have been carried out, and terrorist targets have been struck with success." Strikes in Syria targeted the YPG, the armed wing of the Syrian Democratic Union Party, and a key component of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are backed by the United States. Turkey, a NATO ally of the US and its partner in operations against the Islamic State, sees the PYD and the YPG as terrorists linked to the PKK and calls on the international community to cut any ties with these groups. Salih Muslim, the co-chair of the PYD, called on the anti-ISIS coalition to make a call on Turkey. Turkey jets cannot fly there without the permission of the coalition, he said. The YPG said in a statement that its headquarters in Mount Karachok near Malikiye had been hit, including a media center, a local radio station, communications facilities and military institutions. The US State Department said it was deeply concerned over the Turkish airstrikes on YPG targets in Syria, adding that the raids were putting the US soldiers on the field at risk. The spokesperson of the US State Department, Mark Toner, said in a briefing, "We understand Turkey's concerns about YPG. We disagree, but we are making very clear to them that they need to fully coordinate with us and other coalition members going forward." Russia has also expressed serious concern over Turkey's strikes on Kurdish forces in Syria and Iraq, saying such actions hinder efforts to fight terrorism. Russia's foreign ministry said on Wednesday that in a situation where the war on terror in Iraq and Syria is far from over, such actions clearly do not contribute to the consolidation of anti-terrorist efforts.
Aydın Selcan commented on Turkey's recent airstrikes on Sinjar for Medyascope this week. Selcan is the first Consul General of Turkey in Erbil, Iraq.
Here, there are certain messages given to various actors. The first one is, of course, the PKK and the Yazidi forces in Sinjar, which are seen by Ankara as an extension of the PKK. Because one airstrike was to Karachok Mountain and the other one was to Sinjar-Bare region. Both of them are first of its kind. Turkey says you can't be there, you should leave, to the PKK, which is the direct target of these attacks. This is also a message of hitting them where they are, if they still continue to carry out attacks like the one in Diyarbakir. On the other hand, Turkey gives a message to the KDP too. They say, "We have already agreed with you. You were supposed to keep the forces away from Sinjar. This is our priority." Secondly, after they raised flags in Kirkuk, President Erdogan said it would cost them dearly. This airstrike is also a response to Kirkuk. And thirdly, of course, there is the US and the coalition. Just before Erdogan's visit to Washington, D.C., launching this airstrike says to the US, "Without your approval, we can do something like this."
Our friends Elif Akbıyık and Semih Esmer interviewed the curators of the performance section of Mamut Art Project this week. The event will be on until Sunday night in Küçük Çiftlik Park.
This year, under the Mamut Project performances, we are presenting 14 performances. We made open call and we received 50 applications, and we finally finished with 14 performances. I am Simge Burhanoğlu, one of the creator of performance program, and we are doing this program with another creator, my co-creator Seyhan Musaoğlu. With these performances, we are trying to people to investigate their inner senses with a very basic daily question: how are you? We are not translating "how are you." It's Nasılsın in Turkish, because everybody knows the meaning of Nasılsın. So we are not translating Nasılsın word. But with this question, we will try to make spectators to be part of our performances. We hope to breathe, feel, live, and to believe together, and to mutually reform with the experience we will create together. So we are waiting for people to experience our performances.
Now let's have a look at what's on in Istanbul this week.
The radio department will be on Salon stage tonight. The group has taken its name from a gas station in Sweden. Their 2003 debut album, Lesser Matters, was named among the best 5th albums of the year by NME. Pulling our weight and keen on boys made them gain wider attention. This is their second visit to Salon, thanks to their 2016 album, Running Out of Love. Before radio department, you can kick off tonight with the Turkish duo Kim Kyo. The master of New Age music, Kitaro, is paving the way for a magical yet spiritual journey for his ever-growing audience. Japanese virtuoso is back in Turkey for 2 otherworldly nights on behalf of Kojiki and the Universe World Tour. Do not miss the fascinating experience Zorlu PSM on April 29th in Istanbul and in Kongrezyum on April 30th in Ankara.
Baby, don't worry about where.
The International Jazz Day will be celebrated on April 30th with special jazz events. Ülkü Aybala and Edip Çağlar will be on stage for free concerts from 4 p.m. onwards at PSM Amphion Sunday.
İnsansız anı yoktur ve insansız anı yoktur.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for watching and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Bye.